Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of Diplomatic Enclave. I'm your host Umar Khalid Bhat. Today we have the rare opportunity of having the country director of the Asian Development Bank with us as guest, and we're going to talk to him about what the bank is doing here in Pakistan, the world over, and of course the relationship that exists between Pakistan and the Asian Development Bank. Thank you very much, sir. Dr. Werner Leipach, you're the country director for the Asian Development Bank in Pakistan, to have joined us today for this show.
Thank you very much for having me here.
First of all, Mr. Leipach, you're a German national, if I'm not wrong.
That's correct.
Have you studied, were you brought up in Germany, or have you had the experience of being in different countries while you were growing up?
Well, I was born in Germany, and I grew up in Germany until I did my high school. But then afterwards, I was always interested in traveling and exploring the world, and I'm thankful that I had this opportunity. So I traveled around in many countries. I studied then internationally. I have a degree from a French university and also was in a business school in France and in the UK as well as in Germany. So I consider myself more a European than a German. And then, of course, I went to the Philippines more than 23 years ago to join the ADB. So nearly half of my life I have been actually outside of Germany.
All right. All right. So, Mr. Leipach, you've joined the Asian Development Bank around 23 years ago, if I'm not wrong, as you just said. How has that experience been over the years?
Well, it was a fantastic opportunity and a fantastic experience. When I went there at a young age, I went to Asia and I didn't really know what to expect. But every year there's new challenges and new places to discover. It's such a fascinating continent, such a fascinating region. And of course, living in the Philippines has its own challenges. It's a bit similar actually to Pakistan.
All right.
In that it's a developing country. We also had our energy shortages there. And if you come from Europe, of course, you have to compromise on a few things. But you also have the experience of experience a new culture and many new things. So as a whole, I personally very much enjoy it.
All right. And you started off in the Philippines. Did you stay all those years in the Philippines before you came to Pakistan, or did you move over in other countries as well?
Before I came to Pakistan, I was based all the time in the Philippines, but working for the ADB and being based in Philippines means actually a lot of traveling.
All right.
So I was constantly on the road. It's just that my house and the car is in the Philippines, and that's the base, but you're really moving around. And in fact, while I'm here in Pakistan, I tend to travel a little less, more in the country, less internationally, and that makes the main difference.
All right. Mr. Leipach, when did you come to Pakistan?
I came for my current assignment in August 2011, so that is more than 4.5 years ago. But the first time I came to Pakistan was actually in 1996. So that's a long time. Then I was based in the Philippines and covered Pakistan operations out of Manila. And I was a very regular visitor to Pakistan between 1996 and 2002, working on financial sector projects and our lending operations there. So I got a fairly good understanding of what I was getting into when I decided to come to Pakistan in 2011. And then since then I have been 4.5 years here. I have not regretted this. Normal stay for ADB is around 3 years.
All right. So you've extended that stay.
I actually extended that, and I always say by choice, not by default, because I think actually it's very rewarding to be in Pakistan. Work-wise, it's full of challenges. We got a great team here, and you get a sense of commitment and fulfillment of working here in Pakistan. So I personally enjoyed very much here.
All right. So you said you were in Pakistan in 1996, then you came back in 2011. Now, there's a vast difference of years between those two visits. What kind of differences have you found in the Pakistan of the 90s and the Pakistan post-2010?
Yeah. Well, on one hand, there's a lot of differences, but on the other hand, there are things that haven't changed that much. If I look at the differences, I think, for instance, the digital revolution has taken place. You now can use your cell phone, you get media all over the place, you can basically be informed. I think even when you look at press freedom and diversity of the press, a lot of things have changed. But if you look what hasn't changed that much, even if I look at the cities, I saw a lot of change the last few years. In Islamabad, of course, 1996, it was a much quieter place than it is nowadays. But if you go to cities in Pakistan and you compare that with other cities in the region, compare that, for instance, with Bangkok or Manila, these cities have really transformed in the last 20 years. While you go to Karachi today, and not too much change. I mean, not too many skyscrapers, and particularly on the building side. So these are a few things that have changed, but others haven't changed that much.
Have the people changed?
Actually, not that much, because at 1996, some people I met, like Ishaq Dar, was at that time even a finance minister.
All right.
He's still a finance minister
Yes.
now. Of course, I mean, many people I dealt with at that time, they have since then retired, new people came in. But what hasn't changed is the warmth and the general attitude of the people. I mean, and that is something which I really experience and appreciate here in Pakistan, is the hospitality that you experience as a foreigner. And that has not changed at all.
All right. Mr. Leipach, tell me one very layman thing. Asian Development Bank, it is a bank after all. What is the difference between your bank and a normal commercial bank?
Yeah, I guess if you look at a normal commercial bank, you think of something like HBL or UBL or a Standard Chartered National Bank. Now, what the ADB is doing, I think two things to keep in mind. First of all, we do not take deposits from the general public. That is very important for a normal bank for raising the funds. We do have our equity paid in by our shareholders. We are owned by governments. We don't have private shareholders. So it's a purely government-owned bank who contributed to the equity of the bank, and then our financing is exclusively through either capital markets or contributions from our members, but not from the general public. So that is on the funding side. On the lending side, a normal bank, of course, provides short-term loans to hundreds and thousands and millions of people. ADB only provides the loans to the governments that are members of the bank, so a very restricted number of parties. And yes, we do have some private sector operations as well, but this again goes mainly into larger infrastructure projects. So we don't provide, for instance, small short-term loans directly to businesses. So this is the main difference.
All right, and you said the Asian Development Bank is owned by governments. Could you explain that a bit further?
Yes, it is owned by governments. We have about 67 shareholder countries. Most of them are in the Asia-Pacific region. And they have the equity rights. They meet once a year. There is an annual meeting. Currently, it's ongoing in Frankfurt, Germany, where all the accounts are being approved and policy directions are being discussed. So this makes the difference with a private bank, where you have actually the general public as a shareholder.
All right.
Pakistan, by the way, this is important to keep in mind. The bank was established 50 years ago. So this year we're celebrating a 50-year anniversary. And Pakistan was one of the founding members. So Pakistan has been there for 50 years with us.
All right. So also, is the Asian Development Bank also celebrating its 50 years in general, or is it just with Pakistan?
Well, it's in general, of course, and we have activities all over the region in where we are, and we have some activities also in Pakistan.
All right. You talked about the 50 years of the Asian Development Bank in Pakistan and also generally. Tell us about these 50 years. How many, in all these 67 countries you said who are members and who own your Asian Development Bank, who are stakeholders in your development bank, how has the progress been in all of these countries? And do you remember of any specific examples where you can be proud of the achievements that the ADB has had?
Yeah. Well, I think you see progress in many dimensions. First of all, you're looking at the size of the loans that we had. When we started, we had a rather small equity base. At that time, a loan of $20 or $30 million was a very big loan. Nowadays, the size of the project has grown considerably, and Pakistan is one of our most important clients. Last year, from our own lending operations, we provided about $2 billion to Pakistan in a single year. So the scale is much larger.
Yes.
And of course, a function of the scale is the project that we're doing. Now we can tackle much larger projects, more systemic projects. Also, we're getting more into policy-based lending, including budget support. So the range of instruments of what we are doing today is much wider. Things you ask, what are we particularly proud of. I think there are many things where we believe we have made an impact. If I can just highlight a few of those.
Please.
You may have heard of the Gazi Barota hydropower
Yes.
project. That is a project that was financed together with the ADB and others. Interesting is that was a very big project. It was the first hydropower project of that size in a run-of-the-river arrangement, and it's providing hydropower now at a very reliable, low-cost base for Pakistan, something which is very much needed. Then in the early 2000s, we did a lot of work on microfinance. You see that the microfinance industry has been booming over the last few years. ADB helped set up Kushali Bank, originally as a public sector entity, and subsequently it was privatized. So that was really catalytic in that sense. And in conjunction with this, we worked on the microfinance framework. And Pakistan's microfinance framework, the regulation, is considered worldwide one of the best microfinance frameworks there are. And we are very proud that we actually worked at that time with the State Bank to design this framework, which ultimately helped millions and millions of people to have access to credit and improve their livelihood. So these are just a few of the examples.
But comparing what the work the ADB has done in Pakistan with what the work the ADB is doing in other countries, how would you compare Pakistan with the others that you're working with?
You see, for each country, we have a specific strategy that is tailored to the needs of the country. So in the context of Pakistan, we have, of course, looked at Pakistan's overall strategic framework, Vision 2025, and we have tailored our strategy accordingly. And together with the government, we decided that ADB's priority in Pakistan will be on infrastructure financing, because that is something which is really hindering the development. So one of the main priorities, of course, is energy, but also water, irrigation, urban development, transport, connectivity. So these are the main requirements that the government wanted from us. You look in other countries and they may decide that there are different priorities. So in some countries, maybe we get more into the social sectors. We also have some engagement in Pakistan in this, like through the Benazir Income Support Program, which we are supporting. But we have perhaps less of a dialogue on the health and education side. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't think that health and education is important in Pakistan. It certainly is, but there are many other players working in that field. So together with the government, strategically we have said ADB will focus on the infrastructure side. And this dialogue is different for each country, and this is why for other countries the priorities may change a little bit.
All right. Now, you said that infrastructure was one of the key pillars of your partnership strategy with Pakistan. Do you want to focus on other aspects of this partnership as well, apart from infrastructure, or do you want to keep concentrating on this one?
Infrastructure is the pillar, but it's not that everything we'll be doing is infrastructure. So in our strategy, what we'll say about 80% will be infrastructure. And then we have 20% to do other things where we can be responsive to the needs of our client, which is the government of Pakistan and its people. And one area we are particularly keen to assist at this moment of time is in the area of disaster risk mitigation. As you know, Pakistan is very much prone to natural disasters.
We've had the earthquakes.
And it happens regularly, and it will continue to happen in future. And every time there is a huge damage and devastation. And possibly that may even be worse in the future, given all the population explosion that we have. So we, together with the government, have decided we need to have a more forward-looking approach. It's not just about fixing it every time a disaster happens and cleaning it up, but put in place a preparatory mechanism. So we are looking at institutional arrangements. We're looking at how you can prepare yourself. There's something called mitigation. There's something called adaptation. And there's something called preparation. So we are financing measures in this regard, and that may go beyond pure infrastructure. That also involves training, that involves setting up systems and procedures, response mechanisms. So this is an example where we go beyond the traditional just building roads and bridges.
Well, I'm very interested in this aspect of your partnership strategy with Pakistan. Could you highlight some of the aspects that you've designed that for the future? Unfortunately, because we are in a zone where earthquakes will happen, at what time we don't know for the moment, but when they do and how they do, at what extent they do, where and at what point does the ADB come in?
Okay. This is still an initiative that is under preparation right now, but we hope to bring that to our board later this year. Currently, it's being discussed, but broadly speaking, there will be 3 areas that we will be addressed. One is what we call a preparatory window.
All right.
That means we'll be working with various actors and agencies like the NDMA, the provincial disaster management agencies, as well as NGOs, on awareness and preparation. So that looks at, for instance, even you're looking at the building codes, you're looking at the land zoning, you make sure that if a disaster happens, the damage would not be as bad. If you look at the 2010 floods, there was a lot of damage being done. And if you were better prepared in terms also of not building houses where they actually build houses, or of making sure that there is drainage where drainage is supposed to be. If you had these mechanisms in place, the damage would have been much, much less. So we will work with these agencies to actually prepare ourselves better for future disasters. The second component is a financing arrangement window. That, there are insurance vehicles in the market. There is international reinsurance for disaster risk management. There is something called cat bonds, that when a disaster happens, it provides you financing. Pakistan in the past has not benefited from those vehicles that are available globally. So what we'll try to do is work with the insurance market and capital markets to actually make sure that if a disaster happens, the financing for dealing with the consequences is in place. And the third one will be a window that will deal directly with a damage. If a damage happens, that you have financing requests for relief, for recovery, and for reconstruction.
All right.
And we will make sure through the vehicle that we put in place that the money to actually quickly act and respond in the event of a disaster is actually available. So we are setting up this structure, and we may still work out the institutional details with the government. Government has committed itself to contribute to this, so this is very encouraging because it shows a sense of ownership. And I think this will do very good to many, many million people in this country.
All right. Well, that is a very important aspect. There are many others, like the energy crisis, Dr. Leipach. This is one crisis that the government is also concentrating a lot on. The government is saying that by 2018 it hopes to end this energy crisis. How and in which context is the ADB helping or will be helping the Pakistani government with that?
Yeah. The energy crisis is a top priority for Pakistan. Everybody knows this, and consequently, it's a top priority for us, the Asian Development Bank. And so we have actually nearly half of our portfolio and operations is dealing with the energy crisis. What are we doing? We work again at various levels. One level is on the policies and institutional level, that we need to make sure that we have an effective regulator, that we have proper pricing structures, that we have a proper strategy as far as the energy mix is concerned. How much should be hydropower? How much should be oil and gas? How much should be renewable energies? These things need to be planned properly, and there need to be mechanisms in place. And we are having a dialogue with the government where we bring in expertise. We're looking at what's done around the world to actually ensure that we do have a proper framework for the energy sector. Now, this is something which perhaps for the man in the street is quite difficult to understand because these things get technically quite complex.
I understand. Yeah.
But it is something which is really important to work out, because unless you have the proper framework in place, it will not be possible to address the crisis. And there are some people who argue that the current crisis actually is a consequence of not having this proper planning and framework in place in previous times. But beyond this, of course, there are huge investment requirements. And so we are working on the investment requirements. And there are 4 areas. There is a generation,
All right.
there is a transmission, there is a distribution, and then is what I call off-grid renewable energy. Perhaps there is too much debate on the generation side at this moment in time that you think...
Because we want more and more energy to come as soon as possible.
So people think, and that seems logic, if you generate more energy and you have more power plants or you import more energy, that households will have more. And the crisis is not that simple, actually, because unless you have the transmission lines in place to evacuate the energy and the distribution systems in place that can handle the load, it will not happen. So there is a real danger now, if we focus too much on generation, that people will be very disappointed, because at the household level, you will still not see the difference.
Despite the fact that energy is being given, there is energy, but it's not being properly distributed.
Exactly, and if you look actually right now at the total installed capacity in Pakistan and the total demand, you would find out that currently there is enough energy capacity in this country to satisfy the whole demand.
All right.
That is there, but it is not being utilized for a number of reasons. One, of course, is that many of those plants, they utilize oil or gas inputs. So we do have actually some restrictions that we had on the import side. Then some of this energy is relatively inefficient with old power plants, so it gets quite expensive. So if you would put that energy on the grid, then of course the overall prices would go up as well. But more importantly is that currently there are serious weaknesses in the distribution and transmission system.
And why is that so?
That is basically a lack of synchronization between generation and distribution demand. So that is what I said earlier. You really need to have a proper integrated planning that you make sure that investments are balanced.
All right.
And then, of course, maybe sometimes equipment is a little bit outdated, so you need to have more efficient systems to manage and distribute these things. So huge investments are actually required in transmission and distribution.
All right.
And that is an area where the ADB is very active, so we are supporting both the transmission as well as the distribution with multi-billion investments. And on top of that, of course, also keep in mind that there are many people in Pakistan that don't have any access to energy at all, particularly if you go to the remote areas in Balochistan, in the north of the countries, in the mountainous areas. And there is huge potential to harness actually solar and wind and water, renewable hydro. So ADB is looking also in making that access possible by investing in renewable energies.
All right. Tell me, Dr. Leipach, which of the energy sources is relatively cheaper to harness, the solar, the wind, or this current way of getting energy?
Okay. Of course, there are two sides. One, if you look at the renewable energies, traditionally hydropower used to be the cheapest, but hydropower, the cost very much depends on the scale, economies of scale, which means you really need to have large hydropower plants to actually bring down the unit cost. There is huge economies of scale that you can achieve. If the hydropower plants are a little bit smaller, it gets a bit more expensive. But to give you an idea, we're now looking at about a cost of about 10 rupees per unit if you look at the hydropower generation for the smaller ones, but it gets much, much larger for the bigger ones. And normally what happens is hydropower plants are designed to last for a long time. I mean, you're looking at Tarabella, which was built nearly more than 50 years ago. So from an investment perspective, that has been written off, but it still produces energy. So now the cost of power generation from an asset like Tarabella is extremely low. If you look at solar, solar used to be quite expensive, but there the prices really have come down in the last 3 to 4 years. And that is something where you see technological advancement really making a difference. So here now we're also looking at costs of about 10 rupees or even below, at which it becomes really competitive. So solar is an emerging technology. Particularly with the technological progress, we expect prices to go down further. Likewise, wind is something which is well established and can provide reliable energy at comparable low cost. And the interesting thing with these type of renewable sources is that you don't have really any charges to pay for fuel. So what you really have to do is, yes, the investment is expensive, but once the investment is paid off, you don't have much running cost anymore.
All right.
Which is different than the traditional plants where you need to import oil or gas or coal. Perhaps even with the prices that we experience right now, you see that gas prices has dropped, coal prices are low, even oil prices. You could possibly generate power from those traditional sources at a cheaper rate than you can do from the renewable sources.
All right.
But in the long run, you don't know how oil and gas prices will depend, and you will always be dependent on this. So I think what is important is to have a healthy mix of all the sources of energy and to balance this.
All right. Despite all the earthquakes and all the landslides and you have all the floods that happen, we still have a water shortage issue in Pakistan, which needs to be tackled, and the government is tackling it. How is the Asian Development Bank helping the Pakistani government to overcome this water shortage?
No. Water for me is actually a much bigger issue than energy. People see it perhaps as less urgent, but certainly it is more important and it's more severe, because energy you can generate and you can import, water you cannot. Water is a limited resource that you need to manage very, very carefully. And you are right, Pakistan is one of the most water-stressed countries in the world. It is lucky that in the past, of course, you got a constant supply through the glacial supply in the Himalayas and Karakorums. But with climate change, this becomes much more erratic now. So what is important is that people start to think about water as a scarce commodity that needs to be managed efficiently. And I think this is one area where we really need to raise awareness. I mean, making more efficient use of the water that is here at the household level, but also at the agricultural level. Much of the water, of course, is used in agriculture. I think about 90% of Pakistan's agriculture is irrigated. And so you can imagine if we experience larger water shortages, what it means actually for employment and livelihood of those people. So, I mean, efficiency of water management is a key priority. Linked to this, of course, are also investments. So, I mean, these are storage investments that need to be done to better manage the flows. And then also we're looking now very much into investments in the Indus water distribution system. So particularly in Punjab, we're trying to upgrade the water irrigation infrastructure that would allow us to make better use of the water.
All right, because that is very important, and I think by addressing these issues properly and in proper planning, we can overcome these issues like water shortage, like the energy crisis. And I hope that this happens in the coming years and during your tenure, Dr. Leipach. Now, that was all about the public sector. You're working with the government, but there's also the private sector that is quite brimming, especially in the last couple of years. How does the Asian Development Bank step in while helping the private sector in Pakistan?
Okay, again, we do that at various levels. Of course, we do that with direct interventions where we directly work with the private sector. But we also have now increasing, we're looking at public-private partnership, where we try to involve the private sector into provision of public services. And then, of course, ultimately, our objective is to support the economic development and growth of Pakistan. And that can only happen with a vibrant private sector. So we're looking also at the policy environment, ease of business and the like for the private sector. So we are dialoguing with the government on matters like business reforms, access to credit, very important. I have said previously that we don't provide much loans to small and medium-sized enterprises. But what we do is we can put in place financing arrangements for the banks to have access to finance.
So you work in an indirect manner.
Indirectly. So we would be working, for instance, with the commercial banks to set up financing arrangements that actually money is being provided to the private sector. I mean, there's currently a debate in the country that many companies find it very difficult to get access to credit. And with money, it's a little bit, sometimes they say with food, there is enough food in the world, but the people who need it, they don't get it. And with money, it's the same. Even in Pakistan, there is enough money in Pakistan, but people who need it don't necessarily get it. You're looking, for instance, even Islamic financial markets. There is a lot of savings under Islamic financial instruments, but then the instruments are not there, or the mechanisms for the banks to lend to people who need it are not there. So what we are having is we're having a dialogue with the banks and the government, actually make sure that we can tap this liquidity and make it available to the private sector. But then at the direct level, what we also do is we're looking at investments into infrastructure itself. So for instance, I mean, I've talked about energy, we talked about wind, we talked about hydropower, we talked about solar. So ADB has directly invested with private sector parties to actually establish these investments. So we have financed wind projects, we have financed solar plants, we have financed hydropower projects with private sector sponsors. They take the commercial risk, and ADB then is directly participating in this with a direct loan. So multiple levels, directly with investors for larger projects, or for the masses, we work with the partners, in particular with the banking sector, to make sure that credit can be made available.
All right. You also work with other infrastructure donors as well. Like, for example, I heard that recently with the China Infrastructure Investment Bank, you're also making one part of the motorway. Now, how is it working with other donors?
Yeah, I think this is a part of our strategy that ADB can't do it alone. The government of Pakistan can't do it alone, and we need to join forces.
All right.
So what we'd like to do is we'd like at least to match our own investment 1-to-1, if not more. Meaning, if we do 2 billion in Pakistan, we would like to bring in another 2 billion from other partners. So we enter into partnership agreements with large partners, like you mentioned, the new Asia Infrastructure Bank that has been set up, but also with bilateral partners. Last year, we entered into a major agreement with the British Department for International Development, DFID, where they committed about $400 million for co-financing with the Asian Development Bank in infrastructure projects to uplift areas and root out poverty. So we are talking to the German KfW, the French AFD, we are talking to the Islamic Development Bank, and we'll try to have strategic partnerships where we bring in the financing that is required, in particular for larger projects. I mean, we are now looking, for instance, at some hydropower projects. They go into the billions of dollars.
All right.
So we cannot do this alone, and we can only do that if we do it together with others. Interestingly, you mentioned the new China-led Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was established very recently. And we are now in discussion with them to finance the M4 motorway that it will be between Multan and Faisalabad. And there is one stretch that we will bring to our board next month.
All right.
It's about nearly $300 million, and AIIB will commit $100 million of co-financing along with the ADB. They have never done this. They have never operated in Pakistan. They don't know how to do these things.
So there's where you come in.
So this is where we come in. We help them, and along the way, they will, of course, learn, and then they develop their own pipeline. But it's also much more efficient for the government because they don't need to negotiate different things independently on the processes. We all agreed to follow in this the processes of the Asian Development Bank. So there's harmonization among the partners, less fragmentation, and that, of course, reduces the cost of business. So it's a win-win situation for the government. They get more money, and they have less hassle.
All right. Well, good to hear all of that. But this is not the only aspect where you're like helping the government. There's also the project of the TAPI pipeline. Now, what is the extent of your support or what you're bringing in as far as this project is concerned, and how feasible do you think it is?
Okay. TAPI is another flagship we are very proud of, and I think this really demonstrates the value added that is brought by somebody like the Asian Development Bank. TAPI, for those who don't know about it, is going to be a gas pipeline that is being laid from Turkmenistan all the way through Afghanistan and Pakistan to India. That's why the name TAPI is there.
Yes.
T for Turkmenistan, A for Afghanistan,
P
P
for
for
Pakistan,
Pakistan, and
I
I for India. Now, these are countries that normally find it difficult to cooperate. And to make that happen, you really have to be on the same table and be in agreement on a lot of issues. And this is where the ADB came in, because we are, I'm proud to say, I think we are trusted by everybody. So we play the role of what people call an honest broker. And we have a convening power. So we brought those parties together. We developed the agreements in a very professional way. So a neutral way that none of these countries thought, oh, this is kind of for more advantages for one party. I think without somebody like ADB, it would have been virtually impossible to come to these agreements. And what we have now reached just last month, we signed the investment agreements. All the countries put in some equity in the company that will now lay the pipeline. So the next step is now to arrange for the financing, because this is a $10 billion project.
All right.
So there is no way ADB can do that alone. And this comes back to the previous questions. We need to bring in additional parties. And here, it is not just the official financing partners. Here, we need to bring in private sector financing. So again, having 4 countries trying to deal with this would be virtually impossible. So here again, ADB has been appointed as a transaction advisor. And our job now is to make this happen, to bring the project to a financial close and then start the operations. And we're very optimistic that within the next 5 years, that can all be completed and the gas can flow.
All right, 5 years, this is the timeline that you're giving.
The construction, actually, I think we can do it in 3 years from the moment we start the construction. But one has to be realistic that before you start construction, there's a lot of procurement to be done, and people underestimate the time it takes to get the procurement right, to put the financing in place. And that is very important, because if I look at our own portfolio, sometimes if procurement isn't done properly, you get a lot of challenges that actually then delays the process much longer than getting it right in the first place. So I hope that within 2 years we can arrange the financing and procure, and then the construction period would be about 3 years.
All right. Well, Dr. Leipach, there's another very important project, not only for Pakistan but for the entire region, that is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Now, this, our country, our government, our people hold this as one of the most important projects for the coming years, because this is going to link the different regions together, and it's going to provide thousands and thousands of business opportunities for people in Pakistan. Now, what role is the Asian Development Bank playing in this China-Pakistan Economic Corridor? This is the first part of my question. The second part would be any proposals that you'd like to put up to further improve on the CPEC?
Yeah. First of all, I think this is a fantastic opportunity for Pakistan to develop, and I think it's a big challenge at the moment to bring in investments. So having China coming with a strong commitment is something which is a very positive development. Now, of course, the investment alone will not be sufficient. And what needs to be made sure is, even if you put in the investment, that it also results in the benefits. What the ADB is doing is we are complementing those initiatives. So for instance, the China Economic Corridor finances certain stretches, a number of roads, a number of power plants. We are complementing this. So even we are having an extensive road network. We are now in discussion with the Pakistan National Highway Authority to finance a road from Peshawar to DG Khan. So that is part of what is being termed the Pak-China corridor. But you see, when you talk about Pak-China corridor, it doesn't mean that Pakistan or China will finance each kilometer of this.
Yes.
So at certain stretches that we are doing. There's a talk about financing the Karakoram Highway.
All right.
That is being financed by China, and China is financing this all the way to Havelian, But then there is a stretch from Havelian to connect it with the M2 motorway.
All right.
And that is being financed by the ADB. So while you would term the whole stretch as Pak-China corridor, some stretches are financed by ADB or other development partners. So we are complementing all of this. We are in discussions with the railways. Railways needs huge requirements, investments, and it probably cannot and shouldn't be done only by one party, because the other thing is it's good to have a bit of competition and to have benchmarking. So if you say, okay, we only go with one party, and then you look at the cost, how do you compare this? And this is sometimes people raise a criticism, is it too cheap, is it too expensive? If you have a second partner in this corridor, then you can benchmark prices and we do competitive bidding. And so it gives you actually a much stronger negotiating power. So this is where the ADB comes in. I think we try to complement and also provide some benchmarking.
All right. One final question, Dr. Leipach, before we leave you, because we've been taking a lot of your time. Pakistan's economy, you've been witness to it, is becoming stable and more stable with the times that are coming in the recent years especially. Now, what kind of, how do you see Pakistan's economy in the future, and any pointers that you could give for further stabilization of our economy?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's important to recognize that the government has done a tremendous job in stabilizing the economy. But we need to differentiate between stabilizing and growing. I don't think we have yet realized the growth potential there is. If you look in the region as a whole, and I'm looking at South Asia, we are now talking about growth rates of more than 7%. And this is not just in India, but you also look at the growth rates in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, which are actually much higher than what Pakistan is doing recently. So I think there is scope for Pakistan to catch up on the growth side. What is needed to make that happen, I think now, is to deepen some of the structural reforms, not just the stabilization measures, but structural reforms. And by that, I essentially mean fixing the energy sector, unleashing the potential of the private sector, making sure that public investment is done efficiently, that taxes are raised. So some of these measures actually, they need to progress further. And I'm very confident with that Pakistan actually will come to that level of 7%, which generally is considered a requirement to really reduce poverty.
All right, so you're very optimistic for Pakistan to accelerate growth and to become a strong country in the years to come, economically and financially as well.
Absolutely, and that's why I am here, and that's why I'm excited to be in Pakistan, because I do think that together we can make that happen.
Well, together they can make that happen. That is what the Asian Development Bank has been doing with Pakistan, and it is very optimistic as far as Pakistan's future is concerned. We were with Dr. Werner Leipach, the country director for the Asian Development Bank. We'll be back next week, same time, same channel. Till then, stay tuned right here on PTV World and take care of yourselves. Allah Hafiz.